I thought it was a flat brim. When I pulled it out of the box, I was telling you, Uncle Kevin, I was like,
just gotta curve it.
I can't be wearing this. It's a flat brim.
We mentioned I'm a fat kid at heart, right? It's like the worst day in grade school was like shirts versus skins, and I'm like,
shoot.
See, I've scoped myself in the eyeball like 5 times. It's like, I don't know what the frick is wrong with me, but I just wondered if I wore that shirt, the hooded with the long sleeve or the short, if my chest would pop like yours, if it would bulge like that.
For one, he won't get us lost.
Yeah.
And
I can't promise anyone.
At least you're not wearing your hat like this, like
Snyder
does, and you can't even see his eyes.
Dude, like, it's all about covering the eyebrows.
See, everyone.
You been in that brim now?
Yeah.
Yeah. You're more, Aaron, let's face it, you're more like redneck brim, where it's curved so far that you can't like see your
I don't
eyes.
want to see anything coming from the left and right. I have ninja type abilities. So there's no reason to see over there.
And all of a sudden we woke up and we're like, it's collapsing on us. It started snowing like at 3 o'clock in the morning, and it snowed so much that it was collapsing down on us. So we're pushing snow off of us, and we get up in the morning and there's elk everywhere. I mean, we literally just kind of got out and they're just all around us, and we couldn't really move. We were really in a bad spot to camp. So like, he was in here. And that doesn't make you feel real good when you're thinking you're sleeping, and meanwhile there's a skunk actually walking within inches of your face.
Yeah. On this episode of Gritty Bowmen, we hang out with our friend Cory Miller at his bow shop, xXx Archery in Rainier, Oregon. I've been getting a lot of questions about arrows and arrow building since episode 67 with Tim Gillingham. Tim dropped some serious knowledge on that podcast. Cory helps us make sense of Tim's information on today's show, and Cory tells us how to build and tune arrows. Welcome to the Arrow Podcast. If you live in the Northwest and you've never been to the xXx Archery shop, you should go there. Cory has a cool indoor electronic shoot for you to play at, and he's a limited distributor for Kifaru, so he has pack frames in his store that you can try on with an 85-pound bag of cement to see how it carries. And Cory runs the Kifaru Sawtooth shelter and stove setup. He is very knowledgeable about all things compound bow, backpacking, and hunting. We Northwest guys are lucky to have him in our neck of the woods.
Hi, this is Katie, the Gritty Sister. This podcast has lots of visuals, so it's worth watching. You can check it out on YouTube or GrittyBowmen.com, or you can download it straight to your device using Gritty Bowmen TV. Stay gritty.
If you like the show, please go to our website at grittybowmen.com and subscribe to this podcast and tell your mates and pals about us. Do us a favour and please take a moment to leave us a rating or a review on iTunes or on our YouTube channel. Send your questions and podcast ideas to grittybowmen@gmail.com. If you're listening to this on iTunes, you can see the video version of this podcast on our website at www.grittybowmen.com.
All right, folks, welcome to the Gritty Bowmen podcast. I am here at the xXx Archery shop with Cory Miller, the bow whisperer, at least my bow whisperer, and there's been a lot of talk about a lot of guys have been asking about how to build an arrow especially since we did the Gillingham podcast. Yep. And he described, different arrows, how they're built. We went into some details on. We discussed front and center. He threw out some of those things, but we talked about knock tuning, just all the stuff. But what's been the underlying message, I think, that's come out of all this is that arrows are important.
They are. They're, to me, they're the most important part of the equation. I mean, we can take a perfectly tuned bow and throw a mediocre arrow or a mediocre broadhead, and arrow is going to fly as good as it is. It doesn't matter about how great that bow is tuned. Mm-hmm. So it is very important, if not the most important part.
And you see this all the time where guys come into the bow shop, they buy a sweet bow, and they show up with some arrows they got at the 5 and Dime.
Yeah.
And
they're like, well, I don't want to spend a lot of money because I'm going to lose them
or break them. Yeah.
But I guess if you're missing because of your arrow, I guess you will lose them. And so if you maybe shoot a little bit better arrow, you're not missing as much, so you might not go through as many.
And we're right here in Oregon where, we it's not legal to use a mechanical broadhead.
No, and Washington, we're on the border. So last year was our first year for Washington to go to an expandable. So it's going to be all new for us still. Understanding which ones do we prefer, which ones have worked, have failed.
Oregon, Washington, it's traditionally Washington
Washington and Idaho,
fixed blade only, and now you've
Oregon
got
and Washington. And
now you got Idaho too,
Yep.
which is also fixed blade only.
Yes,
and we've discussed this on multiple podcasts. One of the advantages of a mechanical broadhead is simply the fact that you can get away with an arrow that's not. Let's just say the setup isn't perfectly tuned. You're going to get away with that.
You can get away with a lot, and it's not just only in the arrow itself, but also in you and your shooting form, and all the stuff that comes into making a hunting shot. It's one thing to be in a controlled environment, but when you get that heart rate going and the emotion of shooting at an animal, the form tends to break down, and the more forgiveness is. Just like when guys, well, man, I can shoot really good groups with a field point because there's just nothing trying to steer that arrow. So, same kind of concept happens with a mechanical, is that we just really don't have some wings out there or very little wing out there, and so we can get away with some flaws and still shoot very accurately with them.
So on the arrows, when you're dealing with like a fixed blade, I think it just makes that a lot more important to get the arrow right. I mean, you want it right anyway.
Yeah, but everything gets magnified when you put a broadhead on there, whether or not be the spine of the shaft, the index, the dynamic spine, like what Tim talks about, your fletching, not having enough fletching or not having enough helical to it, and then the bow itself not being tuned or you not being good mechanics in your shooting. So it all gets magnified.
What I wanted to go over with you is let's take a look at this from the perspective of a guy who has no idea what to buy. Mm-hmm. Okay, he's getting a new bow. What are the things that he needs to consider when he buys an arrow?
Well,
and keep in mind we can edit this anywhere we want.
It's kind of a tough. As a new shooter, there's a lot of arrows that are still going to outshoot the average shooter. So, according to your ability, some guys aren't going to notice the difference from a .006 arrow to a .001 straight arrow, and versus, $150 arrow dozen versus a $69 a dozen arrow. Their ability just isn't going to allow them to see the difference. And
when you're talking about these numbers, just for the guys who don't know, you're talking about the straightness
factor of an arrow. And so when an arrow gets built and they come off the assembly line, they pretty much all will have some type of a laser straightness checking device, and it checks the straightness of the arrow, and it gets a logo and a number. And they go into batches. So typically you will find a .006, .003, and a .001. As you get to .001, the dollars go up. They have to go and build so many more arrows to get those straight ones. So they might have to build, say, 10 dozen arrows to get 1 dozen of the 01s. So you're going to get the cost that's going to go up on that arrow. Even though it's a lot of times it's the exact same arrow as an 06. Sometimes you can be a shorter draw length person. Mm-hmm. We can trim both ends off of an arrow and usually get a very straight arrow off of it that way. So your typical arrow will come 32 to 31 inches long, and most manufacturers will measure 28 inches and give that rating at 28 inches. Now that 28 inches could be all right here, meaning that this part here is an 06 or worse. And what can happen is that we can cut all this down and we still left the crooked end.
So you're telling me that when they measure the straightness, they often just measure the center.
Yeah, they find somewhere in here 28 inches. Now that 28 could be right here. It could be 28 right here. It could, so we don't really know.
But in general, it's leaving the end off, both ends.
Yes. And so typically a shorter draw length guy has an advantage. He can usually cut both ends, take the time to cut both ends, and
So
get a really
a
straight arrow.
.001 straightness doesn't mean that the entire shaft is .001. That seems a little bit...
Except for Black Eagle. Black Eagle arrow is measured the entire length of the shaft.
So why don't the others do that too?
I don't know.
Because this isn't meant to be a Black Eagle
No.
sales pitch or
No.
anything. This is...
That's most of your manufacturers are all just done off of 28 inches, and they probably figured that the average arrow is going to be 28 inches. So why are we worrying about trying to make a 31-inch arrow when was the last time you seen a guy shooting a full-length arrow?
I guess so, but there's a lot of guys with...
So what happens is, I would say for an average guy like myself, I can sometimes go into an 03 diameter shaft and make it really straight. Now one of my hunting buddies who has a 32-inch draw length, he has to really go for those Pro Series, 01 arrow, because the length of his shaft is going to be over 28 inches. So he's trying to get the straightest arrow he can possibly get because he knows he's not going to be able to cut any imperfections out of that arrow.
Okay. So you talked about this once before, that a lot of times when you build an arrow, you'll cut... you'll figure out the length of the arrow, then you'll cut an equal amount off of each end, rather than just measure from one end of the arrow and chop.
And that's kind of the lazy way of doing it, I guess.
I mean,
a way. Because a lot of target guys, they'll actually take the arrow on a spinner, and they'll look and they'll be able to physically see where the imperfection, what side it might be on.
So what is this right here, and what is it doing?
Just an arrow checker spinner, so we can spin this arrow and see whether or not we have any kind of a wobble. So a lot of guys will check the straightness and make sure that there's not a wobble on that arrow.
So this little doohickey is pretty cheap.
Pretty cheap, pretty inexpensive, and they're a nice little tool, especially when you start putting your broadheads on there. You'll see it, and a lot of times it's hard to see the arrow itself. You'll see more of the knock, or you'll see more of the tip moving around.
Yeah, I've seen it where it is crooked and it's like it's wobbling all over the place. You can tell. So, all right. So you straightness. Why does it matter?
Well, I mean, straightness is always just going to be better for typically your spin, so you're not getting that wobble. When you're getting that wobble on something like this, that's what that arrow's doing in flight. It's spinning. So if it's already wobbling on something like this, it's going to spin that way and wobble. Now you put a broadhead on there, and now that opens up again even more. So
it just seems like, I mean, I look at an arrow's an arrow. It seems like it would be at .006 or .001. Is it really going to make that much difference?
Like I say, it kind of depends on the shooter itself. And, each person is, some people are really, really anal about, man, I want this thing just to do this certain thing. Well, if that's what you want, you have to invest in better arrows. And I would really recommend relying on yourself, because there's it's never that easy of just saying it's 1, 2, 3 and this is going to be able to perfect arrow. Even myself, when I build my own arrows, a lot of goes into why I build what I do, depending on what bow I shoot, because I like a certain speed. I think other people have talked about this, but I like 275 to 285, 290 for fixed heads. It's kind of where I'm at my happy medium as far as my pin gap goes and about my flight characteristics.
Yeah,
the
Aaron
pin
Snyder
gap is the least of my worries, honestly, because I shoot a sliding sight and I use a rangefinder. So anything past 40 yards, I try to 100% hit that thing with a Ranger. At that point, if I go boink, it's 47 yards. I don't care if I'm shooting 300 or 260.
Right.
My sight is set at 46 yards, and it doesn't matter.
Okay.
So,
because we talked about this on Snyder's earlier podcast, he basically was saying that once you get over 280 feet per second, it just gets much, much harder to tune a fixed blade broadhead.
It is, and there again, going back into those flaws of us shooters, it gets magnified that much faster. So, I definitely like to keep it at a reasonable speed. And the nice thing about that is typically to slow the arrow down, we're adding the weight to the arrow.
And then what does that do for...
Well, one, we talk about momentum and penetration, kinetic energy. The other thing, it bucks wind better, crosswinds. The heavier arrow is not going to get drifted off nearly as much.
So the weighted arrow, I think we have discussed this quite a bit. It's important to have a heavier arrow. If you're shooting really fast setup, you have the luxury then, if you're Aaron Snyder and you want to get down to that 280 feet per second, you have the luxury of putting a pretty hefty arrow in your setup.
Yes. And you start
and then
looking.
that makes the bow quieter.
Makes the bow quieter. It's just better all around. It's easier on the bow. It's quieter on the bow. It's quieter. That bucks the wind a little bit better. The penetration becomes better.
So with all the rage being my bow shoots 340 feet per second and all that, well, what do you think of that? Especially if Aaron's it's great. It's just I'm still going to drop it down.
I like the fact that we have ratings, and I like the fact that we have fast bows.
Yeah.
But I don't shoot those speeds, and the average guy doesn't shoot those speeds either, because all those ratings are all done at 30 inches, 350 grain arrow, and 70 pounds. Now, most of us will not hunt with an arrow that weighs 350 grains, especially in Washington. It's against the law. We have to shoot 6 grains per pound. So a 70-pound bow has to shoot 420.
Got it.
Well, every 3 grains of an arrow weight is a foot.
Okay.
So, right there, that's going to slow that off that speed that they rated. And typically every inch below 30, you're going to lose 10 to 12 feet. And depending on the cam, those, as you keep going down, it keeps going further and further, bigger gaps on a lot of that. So we'll never shoot like that IBO rating of a bow. It says 350. The average guy is never going to be
not with
there.
a hunting rig, not with the.
But what that does for me with a faster bow means that I can slow it down.
Yep.
And by slowing it down, I can do 2 things. I can either pull less poundage,
which is
really nice, work less,
Yep.
get more. So I can pull less poundage and or increase my arrow weight.
Yep, which makes it more lethal.
Yep. So
let's talk about increasing arrow weight. So a guy, he's trying to get his bow down around 280 feet per second. He's got fixed blades. He's got to throw on there. He wants to get a heavier arrow. Do you just buy a heavier arrow?
Well, you can, but I would rather take control of where I want that weight at instead of taking an arrow that weighs 11 grains an inch all the way across. I would rather take an insert type of system. This is a standard insert that would go into a lot of arrows that weighs 16 grains.
This is nothing really.
Nothing.
Okay.
And now you can add this, which is brass, which weighs 75. So we can up the arrow weight right there.
Yeah, this is significantly heavier than
60
this.
60
I mean,
grains.
I can just feel it.
And we're putting it right into the nose, which then again gives us that FOC, that front of center.
Front of center weight. So the front of the arrow is heavier than the back.
And so that a lot of times, if you think about this weighing 16 grains and this one here weighs 12, well, a knock weighs anywhere from 9 to 13 grains. So now we're almost at an equal
even weight.
Now we add a wrap and add some fletchings, and all of a sudden you got 30-some more grains back here, and then you go and throw a 100-grain tip on there. You don't have a whole lot of FOC.
Yeah, so what you're saying when you say you don't have a lot of FOC, you don't have a lot of weight at the front of the arrow. It's kind of balanced.
It's balanced.
It's kind of, by the time you put the fletchings, the knock, all that on the back, and you add the stuff to the front, you're kind of just even.
Yeah, so
not quite. You're little front of center.
The thing for me is talking about front of center, and what it will do is remember back when you did paper airplanes and you threw them and they kind of floated around and did all that.
Yep.
Now you put a paper clip or staples to the nose of that paper airplane and threw it, and
it's like a bullet.
It seemed like it went faster and it went straighter.
Yeah.
So same thing.
Adding a little weight to the front of your paper airplane, and it's like you could aim it and actually
look at a javelin, all the weight, or even a dart.
Yep.
They're
It's weighted
very small,
in the
but
front.
all the weight is right in the nose. So having weight up front is going to help steer this arrow, keep it on track a lot better. And then we kind of go into penetration. And this is not scientific, but in my belief is I have
you're going off the track.
I'm going off. So in my belief is if we took an arrow that weighed let's just say 450 grains.
Yep.
And this arrow weighed 11 grains an inch. Okay. So we only had roughly 7% FOC. So it weighs this. When this arrow comes in, just like when it gets shot, everything's shoving this arrow and it flexes.
Yeah.
It comes out of the arrow, out of the bow, flexes and straightens out. Because we're pushing all this pressure to make this go forward, it has to flex and then go forward. So when it comes to a stop, you have all this weight here trying to push this arrow into the target.
It hits something, so there's some resistance.
So when it hits, the arrow buckles,
bends,
and then goes
and then
into the
continues
target.
in. Makes sense.
All this weight pushing forward. So now if we took the same arrow and it weighed like 8 grains an inch, but we put 150 to 200 grains in the nose to get the arrow to still weigh 450 grains, all the weight is right here. Mm-hmm. There's really no weight back here. So now when this arrow comes and hits the target, this weight back here doesn't have as much to push and buckle this arrow. And so what happens right here is this arrow gets pulled through the target instead of getting pushed through the target. You've probably shot animals where the arrow kind of went
It looks
somewhere.
like it's going exactly right, and it deflects and goes down.
So like, oh man, I hit a rib. Well, did you hit a rib, or did the arrow buckle and then change its path of direction? Because there's really nothing to resist.
Because the front of center was poor. So second it hit the target, and there was some resistance.
Well, it's not
resistance, but as soon as it hits that target, there's
that arrow buckles. And so when it buckles, I mean, you can see where that tip goes as it. Now it's going downward. So depending on how that arrow buckled and which direction it buckled, that arrow is going to follow.
It's sort of like it's like you're trying to push. You have all this weight behind something like a feather. Let's say you have a feather, and on the back of the feather you put weight versus weight on the front of that feather. It's just like if there's weight in the back, it's just going to crush that.
Yeah, I mean, it's. There again, I mean, a lot of this stuff that we are talking is
voodoo.
Yeah, and it's in small differences. I mean, a lot of times we're talking, 7% FOC to 10 or 12% FOC. Mm-hmm. Well, it's when we're talking little percentages, kind of like 01s and 06s. I mean, they are really micro, but if you're really trying to get anal about, I want all this stuff out of it, you kind of have to look at things this direction.
It makes sense though. That idea of how the arrow reacts when there's a weak front of center when it impacts on an animal,
and that's kind of the same thing. What Tim was talking about the dynamic spine of a shaft, and so what that is a lot of shafts will have a stiff and a weak side to that arrow. So when that arrow gets shoved out of a bow, it's going to want to flex in a certain way. Yep. And you can rotate this arrow. Now it would flex over here when it gets shot versus flexing up here. So what we're saying is,
we've discussed this many times, but it's kind of blowing the mind of some people that are writing in that basically the stiffness of the arrow ideally would be exactly the same around the entire arrow. Mm-hmm. That it'd be stiff, exactly the thickness of the wall as I'm looking down it is the same. But every arrow, the truth is, has a weak side.
And stiff side. And back in the day when we shot aluminum is very, very consistent and very, very well. But back in the day we used to, cap both ends and put them in the bathtub and float them. And the heavy side of the arrow would always sink down to the bottom, and then you would mark the top side of the arrow and say, okay, well, I'm going to put my cock main right there.
And then basically what you're trying to do, though, is line up every single arrow when you put it on your bow
to be the same.
To be the same. And it doesn't matter where the stiff side of the arrow is. It's just as long as they're all shot out of the bow with the same stiff
dynamic
side.
And typically that's going to be what's going to cause that dynamic stiffness of or flex of that arrow. Mm-hmm. It's going to be more apparent the more that we have difference. So if we put it on a spine checker and you watch that spine, that stiff and weak, go really up and down, it is going to be very important to try to tune all those arrows to the same. So when I personally build my own arrows, I fletch every arrow the exact same color vein.
Yeah.
Because that way, even though I shoot an arrow this arrow has an unbelievable spine consistency across the board.
This Black Eagle
This
Rampage.
Black Eagle Rampage does. And now, the bigger the arrow, the more difference there is usually going to be.
Bigger diameter?
A bigger diameter, it's going to be that much harder for those to get those consistent spine all the way across.
Okay.
So you will see a lot more highs and lows in a bigger arrow as you would in a smaller arrow.
Okay.
So the smaller arrow, they can get a lot more consistent on building a shaft. But so I'll fletch them all the same, and then I go shoot them and do what like Tim does and talk about knock tuning. So what I do is I shoot every arrow, and I start trying to identify any kind of a flyer. So if I have a flyer, one's out of the dot, I pull that one, even though it's not numbered yet. And I say yet because I don't want to really number anything yet. So I pull this one out and I'll set it aside and I'll shoot all my arrows and I'll grab that same one and shoot it and just kind of watch. So once I find a problem child of an arrow, a lot of times I will put a little dot on that fletch, just a little one, so I can know that this was the guy that 2 out of the 4 times was out of the dot. So I keep an eye on him. At that point, I'll start to identify that 1 or 2 arrows that isn't playing.
Yeah.
So then what I'll do is I'll take that arrow and I'll rotate the knock. If I got hand me that arrow. Thank you. So I would take right now, this is my up vein on this arrow. So I would put it in the bow and I would rotate over to this vein. And now I'm going to shoot this arrow for a while and see what it does.
Yep.
And if it still doesn't go in the dot, then I'm going to knock tune it to the next vein and see if I'm changing the dynamic spine of that shaft to come and play with the other arrows.
And all you're doing, I mean, it's as easy as twisting the knock.
Twisting the knock. And so with a 3 fletch, you've got 3 choices. With a 4 fletch, you've got 4 choices. So 4 fletch is kind of nice because it gives you one more option of finding that much.
Just right.
The scary part for me with a 4 fletch is if I have an arrow that has a huge adjustability of that spine, if I knock a 4 fletch one way and knock it the next way, they will impact different if that spine consistency isn't that good.
What you mean is when you have a 4 fletch, now you don't know which side of it was the stiff side. So you load it into your arrow with the stiff side, let's say, pointing up.
Yep.
And then the next arrow you load with the stiff side pointing down. So you almost have to, once you get it, you have to mark it.
See, for me, the advantage of shooting a 4 fletch, one is sometimes it can correct some flaws. Yeah, so sometimes they shoot better just because you've got more vein to control things. But the thing I like for hunting wise is that I'm not looking for it to index an arrow. I'm grabbing it and I'm putting it in the bow.
You want to shoot.
Because they're exactly the same upside down. Unlike this arrow, if we shoot it down, we're probably going to get some contact here versus shooting it up here where we're not getting the contact.
We just always load it with the cock vein
up. Typically. Yeah. So the beauty of a 4 fletch is that I can just throw it in the bow and shoot it. Now, when I do a 4 fletch and I do get that up and down differences, I go right back and I try to shoot a 3 fletch because I know for a fact when I do a 3 fletch, I'm going to knock it the right way every time.
Yeah.
So being that I haven't really done much with this arrow yet. So once, say I know that this arrow is plain, it's shooting right with all my other arrows. Now that they're all one color, now is when I number those arrows and I make it pretty big, number 3 on here with a Sharpie. That now is my odd color, my odd vein. It just has markings and writings on it, so I can identify that vein that much quicker.
Yeah.
So I don't do that until I went through and shot them all.
Because I got them all dialed in. I was pretty happy shooting to the right spot, and then I pulled my arrow off, and my knock stayed on the string.
Yep.
Now I'm like, oh, crap.
Which one was the up vein?
Which one was the up vein? And that made a big difference.
Yep.
Because, so I've shared my experience before, but I'm going to share it again. When I got my new Bowtech bow, pretty excited, my experience, I'm shooting it, it's drilling the target. I'm thrilled. I have these target arrows that are just wicked, and I shoot it, and I'm a killer. Then I'm getting ready to leave on my hunt, and a month before I go, and I screw broadheads on them, and my arrows are all over the place.
Yeah.
All over. I'm getting some that hit the center, and then some that just keep hitting up and right and some down and left. And I'm like, what the heck? So I go to different bow shops. I go to different places. I talk to everybody I know. That's when I found you. I come up here to your shop. The other guys that I went to, they're like, we can't explain this. It makes no sense. I come in here, and you're like, let me see. You twist my knock on those arrows that were flyers that just went off the mark, twisted it, and they're hitting center, until all the arrows were pretty much shooting the same.
Together.
And it was as easy as twisting the knock. Okay, that really disturbed me. Okay, but I didn't quite understand what happened there. Because I was convinced that my bow wasn't in tune.
Yeah,
that
and that's what everybody will say
right.
is typically, oh, you need to get your bow paper tuned, or you need to tune your bow, and it's not always that simple. The bow can be tuned. Like I just sold a bow the other day. I think I was talking to you earlier about this, and the guy brought it back, and he had some not so expensive arrows.
Mm-hmm.
So he goes, well, let's paper tune this, and I'm usually don't have an issue with the Bowtex with that binary cam and system of paper tuning. These bows are very simple. And this thing, tearing to the left, tearing to the right. And I'm like, man, this thing's... Every time I shot that arrow, it was tearing different. And I didn't even change the bow, but it was tearing different. So finally I'm like, okay. So I grab a different arrow and shoot it, and it goes through a bullet hole. And so there's been times where guys are trying to tune a bow to a bad arrow.
Yeah.
And so now they finally get that bad arrow to tune, and then they grab the rest of their other arrows that are probably better, and now those arrows really aren't in tune to the bow. So it's...
Yeah, I moved my rest around and all this wacky stuff, and then it was counterproductive because the bow was tuned.
Yeah.
So then I had to get it all retuned, and then I had to start looking at arrows and how to...
And typically you're going to find that the bow can be, it doesn't have to be like right perfectly tuned, and arrows will shoot very well out of it if you have the right arrow and a good arrow.
And for me, I really didn't have a problem until I put broadheads on.
And like I say, it just magnifies any kind of those flaws, and those flaws are... could be broadhead alignment with the shaft, could be the shaft itself, could be the fletching isn't enough fletching on there to control it, can be the tune of the bow, could be the tune of the person.
So once you knock tune these arrows, and basically what we've done is we've just sort of twisted that knock until we found all the arrows on the consistently have the same stiffness. It's the stiffness of the arrows. Either they're all pointing up or they're all pointing down, whatever they are. And you can do that just by finding the arrow that doesn't shoot straight, twisting it, until you find the magic sweet spot, and it's now flying with the rest.
Yep.
But sometimes you can't get it to do it at all.
Yeah. And the other way of doing that is...
that becomes a practice arrow. Or a
grouse arrow.
A grouse arrow.
The other thing you can do, too, is actually shoot every arrow through paper.
Okay.
And if things aren't perfect and the arrow isn't all that perfect, or the tune isn't all that perfect, you will get different tears accordingly to where this arrow is being shot out of it. And it can be quite a bit, or it can be very small, but you can kind of start to analyze it down, going, okay, well, this one is just a smidge knock high, and this one's a smidge knock low. So one way or the other, however I want to get them, I want to try to get them to be all the same. So a lot of times you can rotate that knock, and that arrow that was shooting high, slightly high, is now shooting slightly low.
So I got there's people listen to this podcast at various levels of experience and knowledge. So the paper tuning thing I'm familiar with. I've done it for years. For guys that's never done it, let's go over that real quick. It's just, you're just basically... You've got a piece of paper stretched out, just like you think, like a butcher paper or something, between two boards or whatever, like taped across a window kind of thing, an open window, and you're shooting shooting an arrow through it.
Yep. And so what you're going to see is an entry hole and an exit hole, basically. So when the tip of the shaft goes through the paper, it'll make a pretty nice round hole. And if everything's all good, the fletchings will come right out of.
That's where they refer to a bullet hole.
Yep.
Right. There's no tear. It's just a perfect
so now
hole
if you've
with
got
three fletching.
You've got the hole, and then your fletchings are kind of tearing out over here. Then
it's a left tear.
Yep.
A right
so
tear.
You have a left tear, a right tear, depending on which side the fletchings are of the entry. So
and all that's telling you is that by the time the arrow penetrated the paper,
it's coming through.
It was coming through crooked,
sideways. Now, there again, some arrows when they get shot, when they come out, they're coming out looking like a noodle. It'll actually scare you to watch it in slow motion. So sometimes that arrow just really hasn't quite recovered yet. So you got
How far away do you need to be from the paper to?
Well, I usually start, somewhere around 6 to 7 feet or somewhere. And then once I get it to where I like, that seems to be fairly good. And then I'm not always that anal about this thing has to shoot a perfect bullet hole right here. But when I step back to like 10 yards and 20 yards, that thing better be a bullet hole. Because I know some arrows take a little bit longer to recover than other arrows. And that all comes into, front of center fletching, diameter shafts. There's just no way that a small diameter versus a big diameter shaft are going to flex and come out the same, even though they're the same spine. So they're going to still flex with a certain amount of weight, but the wall thickness of one arrow versus another one can change on how fast that thing recovers.
Yep.
So
okay.
So there's this is a spine checker.
Yep.
So this will tell us the inconsistencies in an arrow. They're really expensive, and they're kind of a pain in the butt.
Like, what's really expensive?
I can't remember. It's a couple $100, I'm sure.
Okay. And this will tell us which
this
part of
is
the
something
arrow
that
is...
realistically the average guy does not need to do. You can do these things in different ways.
So rather than testing the arrow by shooting it, you're saying you could
we can kind of look on here and try and find. So I can take an arrow and put it in here. So now we can kind of roll this and you can see that needle move. And that's the straightness of this shaft because we don't have any weight
it's just
on this.
Sitting here on
just
this,
on these rollers.
And this little baby right
and
there.
And it doesn't take much.
I mean,
just any kind of pressure on here, you can see what that moves. So the little bit of, this isn't a super, it's like an 03 straight arrow here. So there's a little bit of movement, and you'll see that in the straightness.
Okay.
So now when we put this weight on here, this tells us how many revolutions, and that tells us what the spine of this shaft is.
Okay.
So you've got these little needles on here, so we can say, okay, well, this one, that's right where this arrow is, and we can mark it. Well, as I rotate this arrow, you see how that spine is changing.
Uh-huh.
So we were at this point, and now we're down here. So now I can go through every arrow and try to make them all go into the same general area, but you can see how much variance there is in this spine of this shaft.
As you rotate it, there's a stiffer part.
Yep, even further up, and now it's down. And
so you can basically get every arrow lined up to the same.
So we can take the next arrow and we can mark on this with this needle here and say, okay, well, we want them all as close to that needle, and then we're probably going to be pretty good. Or we can go shoot every one of them.
Then you found the stiff side of the arrow, and now you could even fletch them.
Yep, you can make your little mark on there and fletch them.
Now how does this actually translate into? I mean, is it predictable?
This is an 01 shaft. As you see, that needle does not
move. Wow.
So this is
wow.
Now this is the other big important part of why I start shooting Black Eagle and why I've stuck with them is, for me, it's just less work because we can watch this needle as we start to rotate this spine, and we're moving about 0.02.
Wow. So that's way less.
Way less. And as we rotate this all the way across, we don't really see a high or a low spot in this arrow. So the odds of me doing much knock tuning to this arrow are slim to none.
So that brings up a point, like you were talking about this, and I'm just being frank, right? I don't have any sponsorships with any arrow manufacturers or anything like that. I just have experience doing this. And so when we were getting ready to, I was frustrated, right? It was just, was a maddening experience for me trying to get my brand new bow to shoot the way I needed it to with fixed blades. And I know a lot of guys struggle with this. They have the same thing as I do. And it doesn't matter when you're shooting under 20 yards a lot of times, but you start trying to, you become efficient archer at 50, 55, 60-yard shots. And then you throw a broadhead on and you can't hit your target. It's really frustrating.
It's just very heartening to watch an arrow just go, come out of a bow, and you're like,
what the heck?
The confidence is not there.
No.
And
after not being able to, I ended up going on my hunt to Arizona, which I had been planning forever. Got this new bow, everything I've been shooting. Part of the thing is I should have started shooting broadheads a month before I left.
Yeah.
But I thought a month was plenty of time. Mm-hmm. And what I found, I ended up getting one broadhead that I had tremendous faith in. And then I'm like, you only need one arrow.
That's, when I started, and it made me laugh when I was watching the podcast with Tim and they said Muzzy. And it reminds me of those days when I didn't really know a whole lot. And I remember grabbing all these broadheads and they were inexpensive and I could put them on and I'd shoot them and I numbered them. Mm-hmm. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Yep.
And number 1 was good. Number 2 was pretty good. Number 3, and as you started getting down into your quiver, they're like a hope and a dream. It's like, not sure where this one's going to go.
Like,
so
I knew the first one would just hit dead center.
Yep.
All the confidence in the world. The second arrow, I was like, okay, that one shoots a little low and to the left, so I just need to compensate on that one. And I practiced
start
compensating.
writing on the fletch, this low left, this one high right.
And then as you get further in the quiver, it was like, well, this one's just real off, so I hope it's an under 20-yard shot.
Yeah.
And that's frustrating. But then we came in and you were like, well, we spined a few. We got a few, like 4 or 5. This is after my hunt, by the way. I'm like trying to resolve this issue now that my hunt's over. Come back in here and you took a few of the arrows and we got a few to go right. I had like a dozen and we got like 6 to match up. And I was like, okay, I'm going to need more arrows that are more accurate, And as we got into this, you were describing the options. Well, Black Eagle, from your experience building arrows, you've seen they have that straightness.
Yeah.
They have the spine thickness generally is even throughout the box. So you threw out some numbers where you might straight out of the box, this arrow maker, you might get
8 or 7
8 out of 12, and with Black Eagle, you're getting.
I was getting 11 to 12 almost, without having to do anything. And so, for me, not only me personally, but me as a shop, it makes it easier for me to know that when I send a guy out with an arrow, most likely he's not coming back going, okay, man, these things are kind of all over. There's really like 3 or 4 of them shoot really good, and then now I'm spending time trying to knock tune these arrows or educate people on how to try to do some of this stuff. So,
yep. And what we did was, you're like, okay, we're going to build you some Black Eagles, and you got some Black Eagles built for me, and right out of the box, I think we had 10 that flew exactly perfect.
Yep.
And then we had 2 that we had to twist a little bit on the knock to get them to get close.
Yeah.
That's pretty nice as an archer, as a guy that's not that techie, just to know that there's a product out there that's.
Yeah, and that's the thing, like, all these ways or tools that we can use, and I think what we did with yours is we actually shot them out of a machine. So we took the human error out of it. We had a machine bolted to the floor and shot those arrows. Now, granted, you can take an 03 or an 06 arrow, weak spine, stiff spine of the shaft, and shoot it through the machine, and it will shoot.
You can get them to tune.
Well, it will shoot the same hole inside of its hole all day long. But the problem is when you grab its next buddy and shoot it through the bow, it doesn't go where this one went. And so that's where doing that knock tuning, we're basically trying to work everybody into a general area. Where it was difficult for me and time consuming was when I would shoot arrows through the machine. You almost had to go through and shoot them all and try to sort down to where the average was, and then start to bring the stragglers into the group. Because if you just started with the one, well, he might be the really bad one, and you're trying to get the majority of the better arrows over here where they don't really want to be.
You're shooting 5 or 6 arrows that are getting in the group, and then you're like, okay,
Now we're going to build off of
now
this.
we're going to build off of these and start twisting and
try to bring everybody else to those guys, because that's going to be the most consistent. You shouldn't get out of a dozen arrows. They shouldn't all be in 12 different spots.
So talking about stiffness still with spine, how do guys know what stiffness to be shooting? Excuse me, stiffness of arrow to be shooting.
Well, there's charts that will tell us, and a lot of times those charts are, I always feel they're on the stiff side of things, safety wise. They definitely don't want a guy out there shooting a weak arrow and having it break and saying, well, God, the chart said I should have shot this arrow. But I typically, and I think Tim even mentioned it into his podcast, is I like a little bit stiffer arrow. It hides flaws. They're easier to tune. They typically weigh more. And so if you give me a chance, I'll always start with a heavier arrow, number one, or stiffer arrow. And because I usually know that I'm going to start adding tip weight. As we start adding weight to the tip, it starts to weaken that spine back up again.
Okay.
So I usually start with a stiff arrow of me personally. Now, the other thing about me personally about building arrows, and this is where I think a lot of guys, if they really want to start making themselves better, you have to take ownership and start doing some of this stuff on your own. And the number one thing I would say is get a fletching jig.
Yeah.
And it's simple. It's nice. You take ownership in your arrow and you can customize the colors and do all this stuff.
It's pretty easy. I've done it.
Saves you time. You put a hole in the fletch. The guy drives, 15, 20 minutes to the archery shop. Hey, can you put a new vein on there?
Yeah.
You could have just done it.
There's a million YouTube videos on how to do that. But what fletching jig do you recommend?
Well, I really recommend, I like Bitzenberger. Some of these jigs here are 30-some years old. They're going to last you forever. You'll buy one and you'll never have to buy another one. There's a lot of them out there now. There's the simple.
Yep, seen those.
Simple little ones. The problem with this is, and the good to it, the problem is that it's just 3 fletch and it's a hard helical and that's it. They say that you can do 4, but it's like a pain in the butt. There's little clicks in there and I lose count. So I like something that gives me options. And this is really only going to give me a 2-inch fletch. With a Bitzenberger or some of the other ones, we can go anywhere from a 2-inch to a 5-inch fletch. And we can go to a straight clamp to a helical clamp and add more helical to the clamp. And you can see that clamp is crooked. So we can do a lot of things. So typically when I'm doing my own bow, I already know what my speed of the bow IBO rating is, and I plug that in the computer. And then I start working arrows and poundage to get to where I want to shoot for speed. Once I've figured out what arrow I'm going to do and what poundage I'm going to do, I take my arrows and I fletch up 3 of them with a 3-inch 3 fletch. And I'll fletch 3 with a 2-inch vein, 3 with a 4 vein, 3 with a 4 2-inch veins. So I make different varieties.
So out of your 12 arrows, you make
I've got 4 different choices of vein system, and I'll go out there and I'll start shooting them. And then I put broadheads on there and say what one wants to play better than the others. And then that's what I'll run. I'll come back and I'll restretch everything down. And this year happens to be this bow, this arrow, this broadhead likes 4 fletch, 2-inch vein.
Boom.
Just shooting so well. So it's kind of fun to be able to play instead of just buying a generic fletched arrow and just hoping that it's going to work for your setup.
You actually build the arrows with the vein setup that is ideal. What about helical? Like how much and where does that play a role?
Well, it can be very beneficial, and it can be also bad in a way that it's a parachute basically on the back of that arrow. So a lot of times guys will come back and say, man, I fletched them up with that jig, and at 60 yards I'm that far low now. It caused that much more drag that the arrow's dropping.
They fly
and they're like,
much slower.
My pin gap grew way too much. I don't want it. I want to go back the other way.
The advantages of it?
It could correct and get that arrow
Bad
spin.
arrow flight.
Yep. So not such a great broadhead or too much vein up front, and more helical is going to control that arrow and slow it down but it controls the back end of that arrow much faster.
The helical, the spin that it puts on the arrow actually stabilizes the flight.
So
okay,
but you kind of find a
Can
happy
do that.
medium.
Yeah.
You know, you don't want it to
So much that.
it just drops.
Yeah.
I mean, I had some really long flats and they were just wrapped. And Jake actually goes, "You ain't gonna shoot that." And I went and I shot through the chronograph, and it was like they had brakes on it. It was like, yeah, I'm not gonna shoot that. I mean, it just really slowed the arrow down. But it's fun to be able to play with things, and that's why I say that it's not always that easy of ABC. This is the setup.
Yeah.
A lot of times you're going to try different things, and that's another thing going back into loading arrows. You know,
That's what I was going to say is you're calculating the arrow and you're trying to make it heavier. I remember back in the day when I wanted to make an arrow heavier, I made it 3 inches longer.
well, that gains you roughly 20 grains or something.
Right.
Not a whole lot.
And is that how we should make them heavier?
No, because the longer you make them longer, it weakens the arrow. You make them shorter, it stiffens the arrow. So it's changing the spine of the shaft again. But you're doing the same thing when you're adding weight in a way. But like
So how do you like to increase the weight of your arrow then?
by adding either different materials that our inserts are built out of or adding weights. So like this is a gold tip system and they're basically an Allen wrench, and we have a long Allen wrench that will go from the back of the arrow all the way down into the shaft, and we can screw in weights. So this particular one here is a 50 grain weight, and now I can throw another 50 grains to it, or I can throw another 10 to it.
Okay, wait a minute. So you can put this insert in this
It won't
arrow.
fit in that arrow, but
But you could
Yep.
put it in here, and
Goes
then
in-
you have an Allen key
that goes
from the knock end all the way through, and you can
Tightens this
just
thing
start
down.
adding weight to
add
the
weight
front.
to it. And
So
you
how
can-
is that better than just putting a giant 125 grain or just
Cost?
a big old?
I mean, typically, if you go, well, I've been shooting, I want to upgrade, get better stuff, and I have a dozen broadheads, 100 grains. Well, to go buy another dozen broadheads is pretty expensive.
Yeah.
To
true.
buy a dozen 50 grain weights is $12 to $15.
Got it.
So instead of going from a 100 grain broadhead to a 125, I can buy weights a lot cheaper than I can buy all new broadheads.
Are there any flight characteristics that are different by having the weight distributed a little bit in the nose, or does it
typically,
matter?
like I say, more FOC, that the better grouping, especially downrange, that we've found that arrows just track better with more front and center and more weight.
Okay.
So there again, you kind of find that happy medium, and that happy medium for us seems to fixed head guys 275 to 290, right in that area. That's a happy medium. It's not. They're not critical, but they're not speed rockets either.
Yeah. Okay.
So
Because I know on mine, you have a weighted insert that tapers out of it. What's that about?
And so that they originally, when that came out with Black Eagle, they had two versions. They had an aluminum version and a stainless steel. So an aluminum version weighed, I think it was like 20 some grains, and then the stainless steel weighed 56. And now pretty much he just does nothing but 56 grains because they just are stronger and they shoot better.
Yeah.
So,
yeah. And those are
that
just to
one-
accommodate the
that
tip.
just goes in and adds the weight to the shaft and gets us more FOC. Now, because of that diameter shaft, which is a 204, Easton makes a brass insert that will go inside the arrow, and this will fit in a Black Eagle or any 204 diameter shaft, so it gets countersunk down into the shaft. Now, this is 75 grains, but we can break off the back of this and make it 50 grains.
Okay.
So if you didn't want to go
that heavy.
we can break it off at 50. The problem with these is really once we put them in there, they're in there.
Yeah.
So you are
You're
what
committed.
you are. Where a weight system like what Gold Tip has, we can start with 10 grains and put 10, 20s, 50s, and we can just keep adding to them or taking off. So guys can put a 50 grain in there and shoot them and go, man, these things are grouping really well. Let's see what 50 more grains does, and it opens up or slows them down too much. So we can play. Nothing's permanent.
Can adjust
on that. And on the new Spartan arrow that I protoed last year from Black Eagle has a weight system that way too. So we can screw it in. Right now he has like a 30 grain brass and a 75 grain brass. So for me, I got to really do some numbers again. But now that there's a new broadhead out, so like if I was using a 125 or 150 grain, I'd probably only put 30 grains extra in there. But if I was I was just going to run my 100s. I know for a fact I would put my 75 in the back of this thing. So I got to figure out what broadhead and stuff I'm going to shoot this year. But I think I'm leaning toward this new one that weighs 150 grains. I'm kind of excited about that.
So what arrow weight is kind of, what do you feel is a comfortable arrow weight for 280 feet per second?
Oh, well, that's all going to depend on the person, the bow, the draw length, all that, and poundage. So
arrow weight just,
Washington actually does a fairly good job as far as stating, 6 grains per pound. If you run those numbers through the computer, 6 grains per pound seems to always give you...
Per inch?
Per pound.
6 grains per pound.
So if we're shooting a 70-pound bow, we have to shoot 6 grains of an arrow weight. So so 70 pounds times 6 is...
per pound of draw weight.
Yeah. So if I pull a 70-pound bow, my arrow legally in Washington has to weigh 420. So 420 grains in most bows at 70 pounds, and you start looking at your kinetic energy, it's kind of where it maxes. It holds very well. You're not super fast, but you're not really slow, and your kinetic energy. If you start going up and above that, the arrow starts to drop off in speed. The kinetic energy barely grows, but the momentum will grow along with that. So a good rule of thumb is 6 grains per pound is good.
Per pound of draw weight.
But like I shot a 488 grain divided by 62. I was shooting roughly 7.8 grains per pound last year on my setup to make that bow shoot 275.
Okay.
So,
but
like I say, on all your phones, they all have, you can get an app, and then you can sit there and start just playing with numbers. And
what app do you use?
Archery Pal. And Archery Pal. Yeah, and this was kind of cool because it will, you can, so in this system here where it says arrow speeds.
Show Brent.
We've got arrow speed, and we can also, check our kinetic energy, and then we can also do our front of center, and it has all the directions on how to calculate front of center. So, but just going into arrow speed, so my bow that I'm going to shoot has an IBO rating of 340. I got to change my draw length to, I'm going to shoot this bow at 29, and we're just going to randomly throw in a 450 grain arrow out of that. And it already knows that you've got weight on the string, 15 grains, which is your D-loop and your peep. Hit done. So that would put me at 293 feet per second. And it's usually within 4 to 5 feet. Pretty close, huh? Yeah. So 450 at 70 pounds gets me there. So I'm going to up that arrow weight to, say, 480. And that puts me at 283. And now I can check my kinetic energy off of that and my momentum and stuff. But that says I would get 85.8 foot-pounds of kinetic energy. Big size, large animals, elk and moose and stuff, they say 42 to 65. So at 85 pounds of kinetic energy, I'm well above that.
Yeah.
So I can start figuring all that out that way of where I want that arrow to weigh.
Yep.
And most of your arrow companies will have pretty good breakdowns as far as what components weigh, what arrow weighs, what grains per inch.
Yeah, I've seen
you can just start
those
calculating
charts too.
Calculating some stuff up. 28-inch arrow at 8.6 grains an inch, and then start adding your components to it and build an arrow. And it's going to get you very, very close.
Yeah.
So,
well, that's really useful info, Cory. Any words of advice or tidbits? Other than what we've covered? Yeah,
like I say, I mean, just arrows? Try and take some ownership into it, and get a jig. It's fun. I mean, that's how almost every person that does what I do. We all started fletching our own arrows, and then all of a sudden, next thing you know, we're turning wrenches on our own bows. Tuning a bow nowadays can still be a little bit difficult because we do like tuning a bow with a bow press, not so much just by moving your arrow rest around. There's more about timing of cams and cam lean and stuff like that comes into tuning a bow. So the average guy to buy an easy press, and back in the day, all the older bows, we could buy a $100 press because it was just a boat winch and press a bow. But now with the bows the way they are now, you've got to have a pretty nice bow press. Otherwise, you'll break your limbs. So
Yeah.
I don't really necessarily recommend guys going out and buying bow presses, but definitely buy a jig. They're not that expensive, and just kind of gets you to not feel so much reliant on somebody else.
Yeah. No, this looks cool. Looks really cool. The getting your own inserts, messing around, setting up different arrows, and seeing how they fly. All of that looks quite reasonable to do on your own.
Yeah, it's easy. It's fun. You can start changing, like I say, colors and wraps and fletching design. Whether or not you know what fletching, a 2-inch.
I need something that say Gritty Bowmen.
Exactly.
Yeah.
They'll make them. You just got to order a lot, but they'll do it. I don't know if it's how many thousands it is, but they'll do it. I think, did Mountain Ops do some?
I think they did. Yeah.
So.
I could run some of those. I liked the ones that Born and Raised did.
But that was their arrow wrap. Yeah.
Yeah.
You can pretty much get any print shop to print you up some.
What was theirs?
wraps.
Like
blood sample here.
blood sample here. Yeah. That was creative.
It was very
Did they come up with that, or they steal it from somebody?
I don't. They're creative people. They had to have created it themselves.
Probably.
But Ty, you never know. He probably found it somewhere. Probably when he was in the doctors for some other reason.
Yeah, true. Yeah, shady cat. Okay. All right. Well, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Hopefully that explains a little bit about knock tuning, I guess. And
we'll see what folks say and what other questions come out of that, and from there, we got more. We'll come back. And on this spine tester, that's made by.
Oh, that's Ram Products.
And anybody who wants something like that, they
like
can
I
just
say, it's a lot of money for really what you're going to do out of it.
Not really needed when you can actually just shoot
buy a
the
good arrow.
and
Just buy a good arrow.
Buy a good arrow. Yeah, that'll save you a lot of money.
Yeah. It's just as easy and cheaper to hang paper and shoot each arrow through paper and make sure and turn nocks so you're not getting a flyer, and that will help.
I gotta admit though, it's neat to see the technical specs of the arrow, compare different manufacturers, just to see
how much
variance you're getting with different companies.
And that's the one thing. And
I mean, I
think Carbon Express was about the only one who did give ratings on spine consistency, and still to this day, I don't think anybody else does. Even though Black Eagles are very, very consistent, but most companies will just tell us what our straightness is.
Yeah,
it's an 06 or an 03. But in print somewhere, I think Carbon Express said theirs are like 2.5, which is very, very well, and that's just because they're a woven carbon. It's constructed a little bit differently, but maybe companies don't want to give us that information because could scare us.
Yeah,
but like I think Victory actually is doing arrows in their spine indexing.
Yeah.
So they're doing the work for us. They're putting them on a checker and putting them all on a certain stiff side of an arrow.
All right.
So
well, cool. Thanks, man.
You bet.
Thanks again. Stay gritty.
Stay gritty.
Okay, gritty friends. I hope you enjoyed that podcast. If you did, please take a moment to leave us a review on iTunes, Podbean, or Stitcher. We love reading your reviews. And connect with us on social media if you're on there. Look us up on Facebook and Instagram, and take a moment to subscribe to our YouTube channel so you can receive notifications when we upload new videos. We've got a sweet deal with Mountain Ops. You get 20% off on all Mountain Ops supplements, combo packs, and apparel when you type in the word gritty at checkout. If you're a hardcore elk hunter, or you want to be, go to the Elk 101 website online and check them out. Our friend Corey Jacobson is killing it with some of the best elk hunting information and entertainment on the web. If you haven't heard, we're doing a huge gear giveaway to try and grow and expand the gritty community on Facebook and Instagram. I asked a bunch of friends to pitch in on this gear giveaway, and they all came through with some awesome stuff. Our friends at Kifaru, Rockslide, First Light, Phelps Game Calls, One Shot Gear, Mountain Ops, xXx Archery, Blacktail Outdoors, and Is It September Yet are pitching in some sweet gear for the giveaway. We'll announce all the details in the next few weeks. All you have to do to be entered to win is like our Gritty Bowmen Facebook page and follow us on Instagram. All right, friends, let me leave you with one other quote from Theodore Roosevelt, who said, "It behooves every man to remember that the work of the critic is of altogether secondary importance, and that, in the end, progress is accomplished by the man who does things." We all have a choice. We can be people who do things or people who criticize the work of others. It's pretty simple, really. Get out there and do your thing. Good luck on your hunts and stay gritty.
This is Ty Stubblefield, and you're listening to the Gritty Bowmen.
Gritty Bowmen.